Was the Conservative Party right to suspend its former deputy chairman? Can we afford tax cuts? And is bad behaviour in schools on the rise? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, Labour peer Helena Kennedy, broadcaster and Conservative commentator Ian Dale, and economist and author Professor Mariana Mazzucato. Today...
Mr Anderson, just a couple of questions. Would you like to apologise for your comments, sir?
Lee Anderson says he's not sorry for his comments about the Mayor of London.
I didn't directly apologise to Mayor Khan, which I'm not going to. Not why I've got a breath in my body. Because the comments I made weren't racist at all.
Was it Islamophobic?
What he said was wrong, and robust action was taken, and the whip was removed within 24 hours.
Minister, was it Islamophobic?
Nick, it was wrong.
The Chancellor says he'd like to cut taxes in next week's budget, but can we afford them? Also today, is behaviour in schools getting worse? This teacher tells us about the abuse she's experienced. Also, the US President Joe Biden said this about the conflict in Gaza.
And my hope is by next Monday we'll have a ceasefire.
Let's pick up on those comments you've just heard from the US President Joe Biden. He said he'd been told by his national security advisor that an agreement is close, but they're not there yet. Negotiations involving Israeli and Hamas officials mean they've been discussing more aid deliveries into Gaza and the release of more Israeli hostages taken during the 7th of October Hamas attacks. How hopeful are you, having heard what Joe Biden's just said?
Well, I'd have to see the details of any ceasefire. Absolutely would hope that that involves the full release of all hostages. But ultimately, there still needs to be a plan for ensuring that Hamas are destroyed and that they don't have the capability to inflict the kind of barbarous evil we saw in October.
Helena, how hopeful are you, having heard what Joe Biden has said? It's the most optimistic message, I suppose, that we've had, particularly from the US President himself.
Well, if we weren't dealing with, I'm afraid I don't have much confidence in Netanyahu as someone who is capable of making that kind of negotiation, because he's so much captured by the extreme right in his own coalition government. And of course, you know, he needs them on side because he's facing criminal charges if he doesn't. And so I'm not confident that they will be very willing to release, for example, particularly certain people who are in prison who have been convicted of offences. You know, a lot of the people that have been released so far from the Hamas side have been boys, you know, throwing stones and so on. And they're that's easy to do. But, I mean, there are some prisoners that Hamas is going to want to see coming out. I mean, there are also people, let me tell you, who could be the leadership of, you know, a proper Palestinian state who should be allowed out.
All right, so but you're not very hopeful, despite what Joe Biden has said. There is a deadline that is fast approaching of March the 10th. The Israelis have said that they will go into Rafah, which is, of course, hugely overcrowded with Palestinians. And so there is this sense of urgency. But how optimistic are you?
I'm actually less optimistic now Joe Biden has said what he's said. I mean, what possesses an American president to appear in front of a TV camera holding an ice cream talking about peace in the Middle East? Surely it's something that...
Well, maybe not peace. I mean, he was talking about a ceasefire, but yeah.
Just captured at an event and then he's asked a question.
Well, maybe, but I don't think as American president you talk about these things until it's certain. Because, I mean, what good does it do? Okay, you can say, well, it puts pressure on both sides. But I just think it was a very unwise thing for him to do.
Mariana, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't just about the United States. We need the European Union, we need the United Kingdom, we need the United States to talk, first of all, about numbers. You know, Hamas has not been weakened. We have 29,000 people, mainly women and children, who've been killed since the massacre of October 7th, and it was a massacre. We have The Economist coming out with the number that about 58,000 more will die unless we have a ceasefire. So what we should be calling for is an immediate ceasefire. And of course, the types of negotiations that experts can then talk about. But, you know, the fact that even some of the numbers are doubted, I mean, just the numbers are absolutely stark. They are tragic. And we will all go down in history, in the history books of the future, for having sat back and not demanded an immediate ceasefire to the massacre of women and children. Hamas is not weakened.
You can demand an immediate ceasefire all you like, but it's going to have absolutely no impact on what goes on in the Middle East. And I think one of the things that we have to be very careful of is, or the Israelis will be very careful of, is to not be seen to reward Hamas. And that was the last time that there was a temporary ceasefire. A lot of people thought that was actually handing Hamas a victory.
You know, I really feel so strongly that we're capable as humans of holding two truths in our heart at the same time. That what happened on the 7th of October was absolutely monstrous, barbaric and criminal. But at the same time, what we're now seeing is really hellish. And the death toll is now so great, and the total destruction of a place in which people live, their homes and everything. So I really do think that we can live with that fact that there are two terrible things happening here, and the only way to resolve it is by negotiation, and we don't have the right people in place to do that.
I think on October 7th, the very, very deliberate targeting of the most vulnerable people in Israeli society. I think Hamas fighters not only killing babies, but in cutting those dead babies' fingers off so they can take them back as souvenirs to Gaza is next level evil. So that any ceasefire needs to involve a full release of all hostages, some who are almost certainly being used as sex slaves as we sit here now talking about it. And Hamas must never have the ability to inflict what they did ever again.
Right, well, on that, let's leave it for now and see what happens over the coming days in terms of what Joe Biden was talking about, the prospect of a ceasefire. Now, it is an issue, the conflict in Israel and Gaza, that has very much spilt out here in British politics. We're going to talk about what's happened to the former Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, who has had the whip removed as a Tory MP over his remarks about the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Now, he spoke to his colleagues at GB News last night. Let's just have a listen, a flavour of what he said.
I admit some of my speech was a little bit clumsy at times, but my sentiment is exactly the same. We are losing control of this beautiful city to a tiny minority of extremists, and nobody seems to be doing anything about it. It absolutely makes me sick to the pit of my stomach to see these extremists on our streets in London terrorising people. I think the party could have given me a little bit more backing, if I'm honest. You saw the statement that I produced on Saturday, which I was willing to go with. It's shown a little bit of contrition in there, although I didn't directly apologise to Mayor Khan, which I'm not going to, not why I've got a breath in my body, because the comments I made weren't racist at all.
He's responding to the comments he made in which he said, Tom, that Islamists have control of Khan, that's Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, and Starmer, and that Khan has given the city away to his mates. Was Rishi Sunak right to suspend him for those comments?
Look, I mean, I've told Lee very directly that much of what you've just said is problematic, and I've also told him that the statement that he's issued doesn't go far enough. I've told him that, whilst at the same time sympathising with many of the other points that he was making. But I think it is wrong to suggest that the mayor is somehow an Islamist, somehow that his mates are Islamists, and also I think it's wrong. And I think
so it was right that the party suspended him.
He needs to clarify, because I've spoken to him about it. He's made the comments that he's made. He said, in his view, the vast majority of British Muslims, just like the vast majority of anyone in this country, are decent people, and he's made that all clear. But he needs to deal with those points that he made. And he needs to do so soon.
Right, but it was right to suspend him, for him to lose the Tory whip.
It's not my... I'm not in charge of party discipline. That's not my role. I want Lee to have a future in the Conservative Party. I want that to happen. I sympathise with many of the points he's made. I'm incredibly concerned about radical Islam as well.
Yeah.
But he needs to provide some additional clarity to some of those remarks that he made.
All right, but were those comments, so you said they were wrong. We've heard various ministers say they were wrong, and they were wrong because they were Islamophobic, because it was anti-Muslim hatred.
Well, he also said that Islamists had control of Starmer. He said that Islamists had control of Starmer and Khan. Yeah, but ultimately, is
it Islamophobic?
I'm not going to get into a definition of what is and isn't. I think it's problematic, and I think we need further clarity on it. But look, the key thing here, and one of the key things, is that last week we had our parliamentary procedures, the way we do politics, profoundly damaged by the threat posed by radical Islam. And Labour MPs agree, because they themselves are scared about their own security by radical Islamists.
And we're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss that. Should he apologise? I mean, you say you want him to clarify. Should he just come forward and apologise and say, yeah, not only was it wrong, but it was Islamophobic to say that Sadiq Khan has given the city away to his Islamist mates?
He said that his words are clumsy. And that clumsiness, I believe, will have caused upset. So in that statement, I think it, but I don't necessarily, who that apology is directed at, I don't know. But I think he needs to add a lot more clarity about what he said. Because
all right, let me go to Helena, because are there legitimate concerns raised by Lee Anderson and Tom Hunt, Helena, about a small minority of extremists at these marches, threatening MPs, influencing decisions and debate in Westminster? That's clearly what the Speaker felt, Lindsay Hoyle, when he cited safety concerns.
Listen, I'm actually shocked, Tom, with you. I really am, that you're not prepared to call what is clear racism and Islamophobia for what it is. I'm really shocked at you. And this nonsense about I was clumsy. Clumsy is totally accidental, saying something that is... That's not what happened here. And I'm asking you a question, which is, do you think it was racist? Because those divisions are eating into our society. I have no doubt that on some of the demonstrations there are people whose politics I would absolutely abhor. But they're very few. And as soon as you start talking in the way that he was talking, you are sowing real pain in the hearts of many Muslim people up and down this country who are themselves put in fear because they feel that they're being lumped together. That's what is involved in racist language. You know that. This is dog whistle politics. This is really disgusting, divisive stuff, and we do not need that at this time. Now, my own party was involved in a business which was of allegations about anti-Semitism. And one of the things you have to deal with when you're dealing with an accusation like that is you have to examine an organisation and face up to the reality of whether there are, and you have to face up to the definition.
Tom?
And you're not prepared to do that.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I've said there's aspects of what Lee said that were problematic. I've said that. I think though that we've got to be prepared to confront the threat posed by radicalism.
But that's one thing.
Because I think for too long, actually, people have been brushing
No
over
one will come. But what does problematic mean? I mean, is Helena right that language is important? This sort of clumsy, it's problematic, what he said is wrong, does look as if it's an excuse, that it's masking what Lee Anderson is really doing, which is expressing anti-Muslim hatred and prejudice.
Do I think that Lee Anderson is racist? Do I think that Lee Anderson is an Islamophobe? I know him very well, and the answer to that question is no.
Well, I think your definition of what is racism may be very different from many people who are listening, because I'm telling you, this is a man who has a history of racism. He was expelled from the Labour Party.
Be specific about that allegation.
Yes,
yeah, hang on, Helena, be careful about allegations.
Can I just make a point as well? I mean, it's not only, I think, racist and Islamophobic, which we should condemn, like we should condemn all the anti-Semitism, which is also on the rise, but it's also xenophobic in the sense that there's huge problems in London that Sadiq Khan, the mayor, is trying his best, I think, to confront. We're talking about 170,000 homeless people, of which 83,500 are children. We have 40% of 7 to 16-year-olds having food insecurity. We have damp and mold and vacant office spaces. That's what we should be talking about when we talk about London. And, isolating a group as the problem in London, and the mayor being too friendly with that group is completely not only xenophobic and Islamophobic, but wrong in terms of how we should be talking about London.
Right.
That has nothing to do with London's problems.
Let me just show you this front page of the Daily Express. It says, "Get him back, Lee Anderson. Tories rally round race row Lee Anderson." I mean, there's been some coverage today that many grassroots Conservatives have some sympathy with Lee Anderson talking about a minority of extremists, talking about the marches on the streets. And yet, where are you in terms of what Lee Anderson actually said and whether it is racist and Islamophobic?
I try, as a 61-year-old white, middle-aged, does 61 count as middle-aged? I think it does.
Yes.
Male, to put myself in the position of an ordinary British Muslim who hears these comments. And if I was an ordinary British Muslim, I would consider them Islamophobic, without a shadow of a doubt. If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. But I don't know why we're all so surprised at this, because he's a serial offender. Yes. Remember, he told asylum seekers to F off back to France. Yes. He should have been sacked for that. Instead, Number 10 came out and supported him. So I don't know why everybody's so surprised. He was appointed to shake things up. He was appointed as the Prime Minister's bit of Northern Rough. And I'm afraid if you sleep with a dog, you tend to get fleas.
Absolutely.
And there is a hierarchy of racism, I think, in the Conservative Party at the moment. I used to think Saida Vazi was going way over the top in some of her comments, but she's been proved right. Imagine if somebody had said about, say, Michael Gove being being controlled by the Jewish lobby. Imagine if someone had said that. Do you think they would have been allowed to stay in the... OK, he's had the whip suspended.
Yes.
But, I mean, that would have been curtains for anybody, and so should this be.
Tom?
No, I mean, I think that he needs to deal with those comments that he made, and he needs to explain what he meant by them.
Didn't he explain them to you when you talked to him? You've said you've had a conversation with him since all of this. Didn't you say to him, hey, you know, why did you say that? What did you mean?
He agreed, because I made a similar point to what Ian's just made about how what he said could have been perceived, even though he might not have meant it in that way. And he sympathised with what I was saying.
Perception is often more important
it is,
than reality.
But I do also think with Lee, I do think there should be a space for MPs and for people in politics who maybe aren't as smooth operators as others. But I do believe he's got a good heart. He is straight speaking, and sometimes that's refreshing. Other times he puts his foot in it, and evidently he did with this. And when you do put your foot in it, and when you do make,
you should apologise at the very least.
You need to get on top of it. And I said, okay.
But Tom, when it gets to the point that, I mean, I identify as being on the centre right. I would say economically I'm a Thatcherite, socially probably a little bit more left. But if the Conservative Party loses people like me, which I tell you, it's in great danger of doing. I mean, after the F off back to France comment, the first time in my life I thought, can I really support a party that has a deputy chairman that utters things like this? Now, I don't know where my vote's going to go at the next election, and I've never said that before a general election before. And if you're losing sort of people like me who've grown up in the Conservative Party, who are on the right, I mean, God knows what's going to happen in November.
Well, doesn't that worry you?
Well, in terms of that remark, F off back to France remark. I mean, you know, I mean, personally, would I use language like that?
Yeah.
No.
But you want to be in a party with?
Is that because you're smart?
But do I sympathise with the extreme frustration and anger? You know, tens of thousands of
but it's deputy chairman
people
of the
illegally enter
Party.
the country every year and staying here from France.
If you're a gobby backbencher, fine. The Conservative Party has always had Peter Bruinvels, Anthony Beaumont Dark, going back to the 80s, people who shout their mouth off on the back benches. He was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, and Number 10 supported him. An utter disgrace.
Can I mention Saida Vazi, because some of the listeners might not.
But she's a former cabinet minister.
She was a former cabinet minister, was the chairman of the Conservative Party, and she's a Muslim background.
Yes.
And she has been pointing out that here is something that the Conservative Party has to deal with, and she's been very alert to it and has her antennae, I think, as a Muslim. She has a sense of what's going on, and she says this is a disgrace, and she has confronted her own party with it. And Ian has just said that at first he thought that possibly she was being over the top years ago, but in fact it's come back to be true, that the sense in which there's this horrible section of the Conservative Party that is speaking in these ways and dog whistling is what this is about. It's about suggesting that the Mayor of London is somehow involved in extremist militant politics.
Well,
ridiculous.
let Tom respond.
I would love to come back here one day and actually have a serious discussion about what happened last week. Which is, and the Speaker himself acknowledged that. Labour MPs...
We're not talking about that day.
Lee Anderson's scuppered that, hasn't he?
Which is, it hasn't helped. Because we've got to have that discussion, right? We've got to have that discussion. You know, the Speaker openly admitted he did something against the clerk's advice.
Oh, please, stop it. We're not talking about that just now.
But it's critically important. It's a huge threat to this country and our democracy, because it suits you to talk about that. It doesn't suit you to talk about this other thing, which is a threat from radical Islam.
Right, and actually, hang on, don't shout at each other.
If Lee Anderson hadn't made his comments, we would be talking about that.
Well,
Tell
just briefly then to Helena, because that was also the substance last week, was that the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, said that he worries at night about the threats to MPs, threats that politicians are being cowed by people out in their constituencies, perhaps people out on some of these protests. What do you say about that? That he obviously thinks that's very real.
And it's happening. I've been writing about it and speaking about it. It's been happening to women, for example, with the threats that are made to them, which are very specific. The social media has created a sort of gross kind of discourse, which is disinhibited, so people feel able to say anything they like. And of course, the anti-Semitism that has been exposed in all of that is very real. And we've seen what happened to the MP of Finchley, where his offices were set fire to.
We
know what happened to a Labour MP who was killed a number of years ago. So one of the things about Lindsay Hoyle is that he has been absolutely vigilant about all of this and really on top of it. And I know women MPs who've gone to see him about it. So let's be very clear. There are threats, and there only has to be one. There only has to be one murder, as there has been already, of a Conservative member of Parliament in Southend, to make us alert to the risks that there are here. This is not helped by this man suggesting that Islamists are running the country.
We're going to move on and talk about the Post Office, because you'll be able to see that there's been a hearing that's been going on all morning in front of MPs at the Business Select Committee. You can see the chair there, Liam Byrne, the Labour MP. They've been hearing evidence from a variety of people, including Alan Bates, who's the lead campaigner in trying to get justice and compensation for wronged sub-postmasters and sub-post mistresses. Let's have a listen to a little bit of Alan Bates's evidence.
We keep coming back to this time after time after time. Pay people. There's a lot of distractions, a lot of other things are brought up, thrown up all the time. But just get on and pay people.
Ian, is there ever going to be an end to this? Because, in fact, Alan Bates goes on to say, it's been going on for years, which we know, and he said, and I can't see any end to it. He's also talking about his own compensation, which hasn't been fully resolved. Well,
it is difficult to understand why it is taking so long. I think there are 3 different compensation schemes and people have to apply. And, I mean, as we all know, if you apply for something, it takes a while to process. But I think if most of these people haven't been paid by the time the general election comes around, there's going to be electoral consequences for that, because I've never seen a television programme which has had such a visceral effect on people. I mean, I was literally screaming at the television, in tears some of the times.
And we all knew about it, but it brought it to life, didn't it?
It absolutely did. So I think, I mean, Kemi Badenoch, I know because I've actually talked to her about it, how seriously she's taking this. But when you're a Secretary of State, sometimes you pull a lever and nothing happens. And the key to being a successful Secretary of State is to make sure that it happens and happens quickly.
Mariana, that is the point. People watching, well, including me sitting here, still can't believe that you can't pull a lever and at some point something does happen, that compensation does come. For victims of this, we have other examples, of course, like the infected blood scandal too. But for this particular issue, what's your view?
I mean, one of the things I always think with any crisis, and this was a huge, tragic human crisis, and it continues to be because of the lack of payments, is what have we learned? And one of the things I think we've learned is that government requires, the public service requires capacity. If we continue to outsource, think of how much was outsourced to Fujitsu. I think it was an $8.6 billion contract, of which much of that also got renewed during the what should have been a proper judicial review. That kind of digital governance, digital platforms, data, right? I mean, this is the 21st century. And we saw this also with COVID, by the way, where this government, I just read about this in my book, The Big Con, was spending $1.5 million a day paying Deloitte to do test and trace. Test and trace was the digital equivalent in some ways during COVID. We need to be investing in that capacity.
You're suggesting that government could have done what Fujitsu did. Now, government is not equipped to do that.
In order for government to even govern a process, administer a process through which it's working with the private sector. Think of the moon landing. That was 400,000 people, most of which were in the private sector, but with a strong direction from government that understood, the aerospace section and also sector and was working with all the other sectors like nutrition, materials, electronics. Government to lead, to govern, to work well with the private sector needs capacity. What we've seen in this country is 50 years of outsourcing, consultification, privatization of that capacity.
Right.
To me, that's one of the biggest
and there's no doubt there are huge problems for the Post Office to deal with beyond the compensation. I think we can see, or we saw just a moment ago, Nick Reed, who is the current chief executive of the Post Office, giving evidence. And actually, in about 20 minutes' time, Henry Staunton, who is the former chairman, is due to say his piece in front of the committee, and that is extremely important because it's part of an ongoing row, a pretty explosive row, with the Secretary of State, Kemi Badenoch, because he claims he was told to go slow, broadly speaking, on compensation payments, and that was vigorously refuted by the Secretary of State and said it was a complete falsehood. How does that get resolved, Tom?
Well, I mean, I take the Secretary of State's word for it. She was incredibly robust in response to this allegation. But, I agree, we should pay compensation quickly. There's also a whole load of other issues affecting sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, remuneration in a general sense, and the raw deal they get from the Post Office. There's a whole series of issues that need to be looked at, but to get to that, we have to deal with this compensation first.
Right. Very briefly, Elena?
Well, I was just rather surprised that it's going to take as long as July before the bill goes through Parliament that is going to exonerate all
yes,
of those
that's the other piece of legislation.
So that will undoubtedly also slow things up in order to, And so, I mean, I really feel that there should be a sort of team that's in charge of this and that's pulling those bits together and somehow seeking to deliver it. You have to basically and make it small, effective, and get them on the road immediately.
Well, let's hope they're all listening. We're going to talk about tax because it's the budget coming up, and Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has hinted repeatedly that he'd like to introduce more tax cuts or further tax cuts. The latest today, BBC News, Hunt considers national insurance cuts at budget. We've already had some, and now it looks as if he's considering further cuts. But the response from the Institute for Fiscal Studies in The Guardian, experts warn Hunt over dubious case for unfunded budget tax cuts. Can we afford tax cuts, Tom?
Well, I think we've got the tax burden at the moment is far too high. I think the government's been responsible with tax cuts it has delivered. I think the Prime Minister's made clear that his priority is to bring down inflation before.
But my question is, are they affordable? You've got the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying you'd have to spell out how they'd be paid for.
And today I saw some coverage of some of the ways that they might do that. I saw some a vape.
Okay.
I saw, but ultimately I do think that the Chancellor is responsible, and I don't think he'd do tax cuts if it wasn't in a responsible way. But we've got to spur the economy. We've got to get some growth, and one of the ways to do that is through sensible tax cuts.
Well, is it? Is that what it will do, Mariana? Tax cuts, let's say further cuts to national insurance. We already had 2p cut to national insurance that came in last month. Would it spur on growth, and is it affordable?
Well, first of all, it makes no sense to look at tax on its own. The first thing is you want to look at the economy and what we require for the economy, so public investment and private sector investment. There's a current massive gap on the infrastructure investment that's required, on the health gap spending around $50 billion in terms of the NHS gap. There's a massive net zero gap if we actually want to go towards net zero, which you'll remember Cameron was saying we had to do. And so then we require money for that. Now, if you just look at the short-term spending, that could look like a rise in the deficit. But if we're not actually investing public and private sector, then you'll remember from basic maths, x over 0 is infinity. So even with a low deficit, as long as your long-run GDP is not growing, then that ratio can keep rising. And in terms of tax, details matter, right? So the real tax change I think we need in this country, for example, is on capital gains. All the investments I just talked about require
equalising it with income tax?
Well, what you want to do currently it's very low. What you want to do is not just think about the tax rate, you want to think about the details. So to get long-term investment, the tax reduction for capital gains should be dependent on how long the investment is made, whereas what happened in this country actually under Labour, this was one of their mistakes, was we reduced the time that private equity, for example, had to be invested from 10 years to 2 years to get a capital gains tax
All right, well, look, Mariana, you've given us the sort of big picture on...
tax is not any higher in this country than the rest of the OECD.
Well, OK, and there are comparisons.
The general tax bill is not any higher.
But it's a record high for the UK at the moment, the overall tax burden. And that is the big picture. If we come in a bit narrower in terms of the politics of tax cuts, since this is a decision that Jeremy Hunt is about to make, how important is it?
He's in a bind because if we weren't in an election year, I don't think we'd be having this conversation about tax cuts. And it is because the Conservatives are in such a bind in the polls that Jeremy Hunt needs to produce a fairly radical budget. He needs to have a few surprises. He needs to have a few things that will be seen as very popular. But on the other hand, if he is too radical, he risks doing another Kwasi Kwarteng, and he can't do that. He hasn't got the mentality to do that, I don't think.
Do you think it would spark the markets, just very briefly?
Well, again, it depends. So, for example, a reduction in many taxes, like corporate income tax, historically has just increased profits, not investment, right? So what you want is smart tax policy, which catalyzes investment in the economy. And if it's just a reduction in tax and doesn't actually expand the economy, then of course it's going to scare markets.
I think what he could do is do something about so-called fiscal drag, where people on low and middle incomes are being forced into the next tax bracket. Yes. I think that has been a real problem, and that it's led to the fact we have the highest tax burden that we've had since the war. I believe in low taxes, but you can only cut taxes when it is affordable.
Right. I mean, Labour said it wants to cut the overall burden of taxes too on working people.
Absolutely. It's buying into the same picture.
It is.
And they should be
Is that
listening.
wrong?
I think they should be listening to Mariana, and she should be giving them advice on all of this. But I mean, I do think that this is election driven. Let's be very clear, and I think Ian's absolutely right. The reason why he's absolutely flailing around to look for tax cuts is because he wants to have something to say to the general public. And I'm afraid,
well, if he's running that scared, why has Labour dropped its or the figure of £28 billion a year investment in green policies?
Well, I think that look, you're not talking to the right person, because I think that is being overcautious. But I mean, I suspect that.
You think it's wrong? You think it was the wrong thing to do?
I do think that sometimes you have to be offering a bold thing which will actually generate jobs, investment. The private sector will invest in this if they think government's investing in it.
10 trillion, by the way, 10 trillion, that's 12 zeros, is the market around kind of sustainability.
So renewable energy.
It's a figure we can't even
part of that global race.
Draw in private money.
But as you say, they're not committed to that figure.
I think it's about the fact that they know that they have to seem to be fiscally prudent, and that is their big.
But there has to be a difference between Labour and the Conservatives. Keir Starmer can't rely on winning just by being fiscally prudent. Yeah. He's got to show the electorate where the sunlit uplands are. They've ditched their main policy here.
They haven't ditched it.
Well,
they've
ditched
the figure.
And they haven't replaced
I think
it with anything else.
They've ditched the figure because they think the figure was going to give a gift to the other side to basically beat them with.
Well,
and so I think that they're still going to be sticking. They're going to be sticking with their intention, and I think that in meetings with the business world, that's what they're making clear.
They should also be reminding everyone that 10 years of Tory-run austerity reduced the social fabric in this country, as well as public investment.
Everything's crumbling.
The economic costs of inaction are much greater than the cost of action.
Right.
So
well, let's talk about
the short-term.
Let's talk about the infrastructure.
It's a long-term driver of growth
that you've just mentioned, because to go back to what the Institute for Fiscal Studies is saying, they want to know where the axe is going to fall. If Jeremy Hunt is going to say tax cuts in this budget, where is the axe going to fall on spending? Because presumably you're not going to fund it by extra borrowing. Well, where would you see the axe fall?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier on, we saw something today about vaping. That was one thing.
I think we're talking about broader spending departments.
In terms of spending,
yes.
I don't know where we're going to be cutting spending. I want us to be, cutting taxes in a responsible way. But the Chancellor, the tax burden is too high at the moment. But the key thing is, if you are going to cut taxes, you have to explain how you're going to pay for it. You know, I honestly don't think even Keir Starmer knows himself about this £28 billion pledge. It changes week upon week.
Well,
you know, and there's no point saying you're going to cut taxes, you're going to increase spending, you're going to do that £28 billion thing. Maybe you won't. No. But you've got absolutely no idea how you're going to pay for it.
You're not sure where the axe should fall. I mean, as an example, if you've got the protected departments of health, schools, international aid and defence, you are potentially leaving it to Labour to sort out.
No. I mean, you're leaving it. I mean, on the assumption that there's, you know, there will be a change of government, and I think there's a yearning for that. However, I do think that what the Conservatives will do is go to those areas that are easy to sell to the public, and yet the cost to the public is great. It will be in the Home Office and it will be in the Justice Department. Now, our justice system, and I say this as a lawyer, our justice system is absolutely in total disrepair. It's collapsing. The cases are not coming on for 3 and 4 years. Victims are suffering as a consequence
of this. Would Labour reverse tax cuts? Would Labour reverse tax cuts?
All I'm saying to you is this is where the Conservatives will go, and let me tell you, the general public suffer the consequences.
I don't think that's right. There is only one budget where you can make significant cuts, and it's the Department of Work and Pensions, because it has such a massive budget. Now, I'm not advocating that, but you can tinker around with the Ministry of Justice. It has a tiny budget compared to most other departments.
Spend on it.
But I think if they were to do that, it would be the DWP.
Well, we'll find out, and we've got a special programme here on Politics Live covering the budget on March the 6th. We're going to talk about schools because of several reports this week of an increase in poor student behaviour. Now, someone who knows about this is Wendy Exton. She's a secondary school teacher and sits on the National Executive of the Teachers Union, the NASUWT. She joins us from Bristol. Hello to you, Wendy. You've been a teacher for decades. In your experience, is student behaviour getting worse?
Yes, massively so. I think in particular since the pandemic, we've just seen this huge decline in standards of behaviour and types of behaviour that we've never experienced before.
Can you give us some examples of the sort of behaviour you are now routinely seeing in the classroom?
I mean, what's become prevalent the last couple of years is derogatory sexualised behaviour, derogatory terms and disruption with threats of violence and threats using weapons as well.
And you think it's down partly to lockdowns or to the pandemic when children weren't going into school. What do you think the solution might be?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that since the pandemic, but what we've also seen is cuts in services. So, you know, external agencies that we used to rely on, the funding's no longer there. I think, you know, if we've got to tackle this, we need an approach that is not only more funding into these external agencies, it's also regulation of those external agencies and a government approach whereby we've got the power to be able to deal with these behaviours because we're so limited as to what we can actually do.
OK, you're limited to what you can do, but you quit, didn't you? Didn't you quit your job because of bad behaviour?
I had to leave. I had to go. I had a diagnosis of PTSD. And I'm, you know, tough. I'm not, you know, a shrinking violet. But it got to me to that extent that
you have PTSD.
Right. Yeah.
OK.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how specific you can be, but was it the fact that it was happening on a daily basis, or was it specific types of behaviour that gave you post-traumatic stress disorder?
It was a mixture of both. It was the daily occurrence of going into the unknown and the extremes of behaviour that I was subjected to. I mean, when you're threatened daily and you don't know what is going to happen when you walk into that classroom, it has a detrimental effect on you.
All right, Wendy, stay with us. Ian, what's your reaction to what you've just heard from Wendy?
I hear it all the time on my radio show from teachers. A friend of mine is a male primary school teacher, a fairly unusual being male in a primary school.
This is at primary school. Wendy's talking about secondary school.
And he is attacked at least once a week by a 5-, 6-, 7-year-old, physically attacked. And I think Wendy would confirm that in that situation, there's very little that the teacher is allowed to do. And I think she's absolutely right. When there's got to be the balance has got to be tipped towards the teacher here, giving the teachers more powers to do this, because there just needs to be one allegation and the teacher is suspended, no matter how spurious it might appear at the time.
I mean, Mariana, what do you make of COVID pandemic being partly accelerating this kind of behaviour?
Sure. I mean, COVID, we know there's all sorts of statistics out there how mental health problems amongst teenagers and young people increase. At the same time, again, looking back at what's happened in the last 10 years with public investment, we've reduced the money that we're spending on mental health programs, after-school clubs, youth centres, which of course has also been shown to be linked to youth crime. And don't forget the cost of living crisis that is being faced by many families. So these young people are in homes, often with huge amounts of stress. This should be taken as an opportunity for investment. Again, even just economically, forget that we care about people, and that should be the first thing. We care about human beings and their well-being, but the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. So, of course,
Tom,
we should be taking care of these young people.
So I think a massive thing here that hasn't been discussed yet is special educational needs. And I think it's some of the failings on special educational needs provision. And actually, if you're a young person, you feel that the system is failing you, it's ever so tempted to turn against.
And does that need more investment?
And one of the depressing things, if you don't deal with this, and we saw it in our prison education report, where almost half of those in prison have got some kind of, they are neurodiverse. So I think, and for example, in my area, we've had a failing SEND services. You've got, and a lot of that's to do with money, but it's not all just to do with money. But I think, if you don't get SEND right, and you don't have enough SEND places, so you have young people who are maybe in a mainstream school where actually a special school would be better for them, then it's not surprising some of this happens. And add to that some failing mental health services. And you've got a cocktail.
Do you agree with what you've just heard there from Tom Hunt, Wendy? Because you worked previously in a school looking after pupils who'd been excluded.
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to that. I mean, what we've got is there's a huge need for SEND places, but it's whether it's the right place for those students, because what we're seeing recently is more and more students that are accessing these services because they've been diagnosed as specific needs. And I think we're in a danger sometimes of trying to explain poor behaviour away by it being a SEND need. And it's not always appropriate.
Sometimes it is appropriate.
Well, of course. I mean,
yeah, definitely.
Go on, Wendy. I mean, there is a tension, of course, between the pressure on schools to not exclude, and Wendy, I'm going to just put this to one of my other guests, Helena, and the number of children who are excluded, the outcomes not being always that great for them because of a lack of provision. But this point that Wendy made at the beginning about derogatory sexualised behaviour, the increase, Labour, I think, are sort of tackling this or trying to tackle this issue. What do you think has led to such an increase in that?
Oh, I mean, listen, I don't want to, harp on about it, but I do think social media has made a great difference to the nature of the way in which people learn about sexual matters, the way in which it's so readily available, and some of it is gross. And we know about those people online who are, hate women, put out misogynistic tropes. And so, I mean, I do think that kids are picking up on all of that, and they go onto their phones and they see it all the time. And so then they start saying, I mean, I know teachers as well who say that they are being described in the presence of the class in sexualized ways, referring to the size of their bodies and all manner of stuff, and what people want to do to them or what people would not want to do to them. And it's humiliating and degrading, and it's horrible.
Well, and Wendy, you are nodding away there, because some people watching may say, look, there's always been poor behaviour in schools. What differentiates the sort of bad behaviour that you've been seeing recently?
I think it's the derogatory, sexualised and threats of knife crime, that, or being stabbed, or, children threatening to come and find your families and stab them. And also, what we can do in to address this.
And you experienced that, did you? People saying that to you? People saying that to you?
Oh, yeah. It's a daily thing, that sort of abuse directed at you. And in front of a class, it's embarrassing. It's humiliating. What can you do? You're under pressure to teach and get results. You don't want to exclude, and schools don't want to exclude children either. So it's what powers do we have to address these behaviours, and we just don't have them.
Wendy Exton, thank you very much for joining us. It's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.